I believe I've shared with you on multiple occasions that I am something of an avid reader. I just love reading, and I have ever since I learned how to read for the first time. I was always trying to read above my grade level in the hopes that maybe I could just appear smarter or something like that. But now to this day, I don't think that there's a better way to wind down from the end of your day than to put your nose into a good book. I've learned the hard way, though, that sometimes if you do that at the end of your day, you put your nose into a good book, you wind up staying way later than you need to, and you miss out on some sleep, and occasionally you don't need your book light after a little while. That sort of thing actually happened to me this week. I was reading every year, this time of the year, I like to read a Christmassy story, and so I was reading this story about a guy and a girl who meet and start to fall in love until they're being chased by an axe-wielding maniac in a reindeer costume. I don't want to bore you with that story. It's just fairly standard Christmas story. But I love to read. I think it's just one of the most fun things that I can do with myself, to get myself escaped and go into a whole other world. And Lord help me, I have done everything I can to try to pass my love of reading on to my children. I can't tell you how many times Mandy and I have taken the girls and tried to introduce them into the world of reading. We've bought them a myriad of different books on a variety of different subjects in the hope that maybe something would catch and it would begin that spark of reading. To an extent, it's worked a little bit. Robin is a lot more interested in reading sometimes than Adrian is. Robin has found a couple of book series that she really likes, and so we're going all in on those. Adrian loves to read comic books and graphic novels, so at least I've passed that love on to her, but I did find out recently that could be somewhat irritating. She told me a couple of days ago, "Hey Dad, I'm reading this comic book about Anne of Green Gables," and Dad was really confused because they had the whole set of the Anne of Green Gables series sitting in their bedroom. We bought it for him like 2 Christmases ago, and I think that only 4 pages of that book have actually been read. And we tried our best to just keep getting him to do this. And so eventually we reached the point where we can't keep buying these books they're not going to read. So let's take him to the only place that you can take a kid who you're trying to spark that interest in reading. We took him to the library. And when we found the section at the South Branch Library that was appropriate for their age group, their dad just kind of lit up because it was like walking down memory lane for me. I got to see a whole bunch of book series that I loved as a kid, and I tried my best to encourage them to read them. Things like Encyclopedia Brown, things like the Hardy Boys, things like Scary Tales to Tell in the Dark, and then my personal favorite, Goosebumps. I loved the Goosebumps books as a kid. I remember cleaning my dad's bus so many times in the hopes that he would increase my allowance just enough to get the next version of Monster Blood. Now you guys are all getting really concerned about me, aren't you? Yeah, my reading choices at least. But we tried our best to do that, and nothing worked. Nothing seemed to stick for them. They weren't interested in the stuff that Dad loved, no matter how much I tried to tell them how great it is and how amazing this is and why I love it so much. And then finally I thought that I found it. I found the books that are going to be the ones that would get them into reading. I knew these would be it, because as I turned, I saw at the South Branch Library almost the complete collection of the Choose Your Own Adventure series. Talk about a gold mine. As a kid, I remember poring over those Choose Your Own Adventures, reading them and rereading them. If you're not familiar with the Choose Your Own Adventure series, it's really the only series of books that lets you decide how the story plays out. What happens is you reach the end of a chapter or something like that, and it kind of ends on a cliffhanger, and then on the bottom it says, to choose this, go to page 94, or to make this decision, go to page 116. And then you get to flip over there, and you decide how the story plays out. And to me, I thought it would be just a great way for them to be able to decide how to go about reading this story, because they get to decide how the story plays out. And I remember as a kid, one of the things that I loved most about Choose Your Own Adventures, one of the things that I thought was the coolest feature of it, is that if you made that decision and you made that leap of, I'm going to choose to go down the right door or whatever, and you read a couple of pages on what happens in the right door and you hate that, well, you could just go back and make a different choice. You could go back and choose the left door instead of the right one. You could just figure out how you want this story to play out. And so many times in life, we kind of wish that life would play out like that, right? Where you get to make a decision of some kind and you can just go back and decide, what would have happened if I made a different choice there? Right, even if your life has played out well, there's still those what-ifs of life. I know that I have those myself. Like, what would have happened if things would have been ever so slightly different along this path? Right, like what would have happened if I'd been chosen instead of the other person to go on that internship at that church in Las Vegas? How would my life be a little bit different? What would have happened if I decided to just have the guts to go ahead and ask that girl out? How would my life be different? What would have been different if I chose the meatball sub instead of the cold cut combo? Life is a series of what ifs, even on the best of occasions. It'd be so great, like a choose your own adventure book, to be able to go back and just find out how the story would be different. And sometimes in my life, I really wish that I could go back and make a different choice, because the choice that I made wasn't the right one. It wasn't the choice that I should have made in that moment. I've been guilty multiple times of taking actions or especially saying things that I really wish I could go back and pick a different chapter, say something else or do something else. Every single one of us, we live with regrets. We've made choices in our lives that if we could go back and make a different choice, we would. We'd gladly skip back a few more pages just so we could start anew. Every single one of us carry regrets with us, and sometimes that regret is because of a decision that we made in the heat of the moment. We didn't think about the consequences of it. We didn't think about the ripple effect that one choice would have in our lives. Sometimes that regret is because we said something to a loved one that we really shouldn't have. We scarred that relationship and changed it in a way that is not positive. Sometimes that regret is because we felt like we were forced into something that we didn't really want to do in the first place, but we felt like we didn't have a choice. And the thing about regret is that the more that we get around it, the more it begins to feel like an albatross. That it weighs us down, because regrets have this unique way of kind of tainting everything else in our lives. Some of us, we have those regrets, and they are always at the forefront of our mind. They're the first thing that we think about when we wake up in the morning. They're the last thing that we think about when we go to bed that night. Every decision that we make is weighed against, well, what happens if this happens again? Some of us, though, we don't think about those regrets. We're somehow able to put them on the back burner, but then when somebody says something, or when something happens that reminds us of that situation, we are instantly back in that moment. We're reminded of the choice that we made or the thing that we said, and we're immediately right back into our sorrow and our guilt. Regrets have a way of tainting everything else around us. And we begin to wonder if there's ever going to be anything that'll help us overcome those regrets. I have to imagine that for our next woman of Christmas, everything in her life was tainted by her regret over one particular moment. Because that moment of regret would lead to further pain in her life. It's entirely possible that a lot of the other women of Christmas that we have talked about probably lived with their own versions of regret. But I think for today's woman of Christmas, the reason why it's so painful for her is because it would become the thing that she was ultimately identified as. So much so to the point that Matthew, as he's writing down the entire lineage and the genealogy of Jesus, he does not actually refer to her by her name. Because it says in Matthew chapter 1, verse 6, it says, David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. And so even if you've never heard about this particular narrative, even if you have no knowledge of what it is that we're going to talk about or the story that we're going to cover today, you're at least given an indication as to what's happening here and how this entire situation is played out and what this point of regret that the woman that we would come to know as Bathsheba had to live with on a daily basis. Our story begins in 2 Samuel chapter 11. So if you got a Bible or your Bible app, turn it to 2 Samuel chapter 11 so that way you can kind of follow along with where we're going. But I'm going to tell you, we're going to do something a little bit different today when it comes to this particular narrative. I have heard probably 100 different sermons on this particular narrative. I've preached at least 2 or 3 messages revolving around this particular narrative. And all the time that has happened, we tend to focus on David. And that kind of makes sense because in 2 Samuel, or both 1 and 2 Samuel, but especially 2 Samuel, David is kind of the main character. He's the one that everything is focused on. He's the one that's kind of where we focus all of our attention on. And so it kind of makes Bathsheba herself more of a role to play. Just a bit part in this entire narrative. And we have a tendency to do so. We kind of write her off as just a source of temptation for this otherwise man of God. But if you really want to look at this narrative, our man of God doesn't really look like a man of God here. But because he's the focus and because he's the main character, if you will, we don't think of Bathsheba as a living, breathing person. We don't think of her as a woman who likely had her own hopes and dreams and goals and ambitions in her life and had an idea of how she wanted things to go. We don't tend to take Bathsheba's feelings into consideration when we talk about this particular narrative. But we're going to try to look at things from her perspective today. We're going to attempt to do just that. And we're going to find out where this painful story of regret fits into the overall story of Christmas. And when this narrative starts out, Bathsheba is, well, she's taking a bath. I kind of consider Bathsheba to be one of the most ironically named women in all of Scripture. Right? The first time we meet her, she's taking a bath. Her name is Bathsheba. Anybody else find the irony in that? Just me? Thanks, Dylan. Appreciate it, buddy. It was a very girly laugh, too. But when we meet Bathsheba, she's taking a bath, and she's taking a bath outside. Verse 2 of 2 Samuel 11 says, "One evening David got up from his bed and strolled around on the roof of the palace, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, a very beautiful woman." Now, you and I might consider it a bit strange that someone is bathing outside. I don't know about you. I want to be as inside as I possibly can be when I'm bathing. Right? We understand the importance of hygiene and taking care of yourself. But so we would ask the question, why is this woman bathing outside? But really, if you think about it, I want to remind you of a couple of things that we tend to overlook when it comes to these sorts of things. First off, there are no indoor plumbing in this particular time period. And because there's no indoor plumbing, that means that there's no water heaters. Have you ever tried to take a cold bath? Does that sound like fun to you? Right. So the reason why she's bathing outside is that early in the morning you would set your water for that bath that you're going to have. You would set it outside in direct sunlight if you could. And because this is a desert area, it gets rather warm throughout the day. And so all day long you have that sun beating down on that water and it is getting it nice and warm for you so that when the evening hours come, that water is at just the perfect temperature for you to bathe. My wife and I have different opinions on what's the perfect temperature in which to shower. I like it to be nice and warm and toasty. She likes it to be melt the flesh off of you hot. Like that's how she gets clean. She just burns away the outer layer. What's that? I'm just a baby, apparently. But Bathsheba does this because it's enabled to get the water warm. So this is more of a practicality, not so much that she wants to put herself on display. But David finds himself wandering around on the roof of the palace, and he sees this woman bathing. And when David sees this beautiful woman bathing, he and subsequently we learn something that's really important about her. She's married. It says in verse 3, "So David sent someone to inquire about her. And he said, 'Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?'" She's married to Uriah, who is off fighting in a battle. And we've talked about this narrative once or twice before, and we've always pointed out David should probably be at that battle. But Uriah is off and fighting for his country and fighting for David himself. And David learns that this beautiful woman that he sees bathing, well, she is married. We tend to overlook this because it's so obvious that we just pass on by it. But David has no benefit of the doubt in the rest of this narrative. When he learns that she's married, he knows that what he has on his mind is wrong. So when he goes ahead and calls for her to come to his palace, it makes what's supposed to be the hero of this story not look very heroic. But we want to focus in on Bathsheba's perspective here. She is being told by the king to come to the palace. I kind of am curious, whenever she first receives her summon to come to the palace because the king has decreed it so, what's running through her mind? Right? For me, it might be something like, whenever you were a kid and you were told, you needed to come to the teacher's desk, or you needed to go to the principal's office, or maybe your mom called you from another room to come to her. I don't know about how you felt in those particular moments, but my brain instantaneously went to, what did I do wrong? Right? There's that part of you that as you're making that journey, and as she was likely making her way from her home to the palace, she's wondering, what could I have done? What could I have done that would be so wrong that the king would call me into this? It's kind of that disconnected sense of guilt, really. Why would the king be calling me in here? It's that part that immediately stresses out. And when she gets there, well, the writer of Samuel, he's just kind of straightforward with it. He just gets right to the meat of the whole thing. In verse 4, he writes, David sent messengers to get her. When she came to him, he slept with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness, and afterwards she returned home. I'm going to be honest with you. There's a part of this narrative that there's several parts of this narrative that bother me. But there's one particular thing that I really wish that the writer of 2 Samuel would have just taken a moment and given us just some indication here, because at no point are we told about how Bathsheba felt about all this. I want to remind you again, she's being propositioned by the king, the leader of the entire nation, the one who, at a whim, could have one of his soldiers and guards come into that room and kill her. There's a better than good chance that Bathsheba did not necessarily want to make this choice, but felt like she had to. There's a better than good chance Bathsheba was an unwilling participant in this decision that's made. Because what else could she do? He's the king. And Bathsheba, you have to imagine, she gets up from David's bed and she goes back home. The only silver lining that we have in this whole thing is that one little line right there in the middle, that she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. That hints that the time of her monthly cycle has reached its end. And so maybe, just maybe, it's going to work out okay because, well, she can't get pregnant, right? Wouldn't be the first person to make that mistake. We tend to read verses 4 and 5 just one right after another, right? Like it's just a continuation of the story. But we know from basic biology that there's probably a period of weeks between those two verses. Weeks of Bathsheba at home alone, thinking about this, dwelling upon this one particular moment. Her husband's been away at war. The king propositioned her, and she didn't feel like she had a choice. And so There's probably a whole wave of emotions that are going through her throughout those weeks. And then she finds out that there was an unintended consequence for this choice that she felt forced to make. Because now she's pregnant. Uriah, her husband, has been away at war probably for months at this point. And so there's no doubt as to who the father of this child could possibly be. And you got to think there are a million thoughts that race through Bathsheba's mind there. What's Uriah going to think? He's going to come home and either I'm going to be very pregnant or there's going to be a baby in my arms and he's going to know it's not his. What's he going to do? What's King David going to do when I tell him? Right? Is he going to want to cover this thing up? Is he going to end my life in the hopes that maybe nobody finds out? How am I ever going to live past that moment? But verse 5 says, the woman conceived and sent word to inform David, I am pregnant. And a lot of us in here, we know kind of what happens next in this narrative. Right? We know that David kind of gets it in his mind, I got to cover this whole thing up. And so he sends word to his soldiers to send Uriah back. And he does so under the guise of, I want Uriah to tell me how the war is going. I want him to be the one to tell me, what do we need? What needs to happen? Do we need to send more soldiers? Do we need to send more weapons? Do I need to just, call him back because it ain't going so hot? Do I need to encourage him because we're just winning the whole thing? But David is hoping that when Uriah comes home, even for just that short period of time to inform him of how the war is going, he's going to do what returning soldiers do when they get home to their wives. Look, if you look throughout all of history, every time a war has ended, there's been a population increase that's taken place. We have a whole generation referred to as baby boomers. So David is hoping that maybe we can cover this whole thing up by having Uriah come home. And we're not told if Bathsheba knows about this plan. But you got to think that she's going to know her husband is asleep outside. She's got to know that Uriah, rather than come inside and be with his wife, instead chooses to sleep outside of his own door because he recognizes, my friends, my fellow soldiers, they can't come home and be with their wives. So why should I? And you got to think that Bathsheba just feels even more regret and even more guilt, recognizing my husband is truly an honorable man, and I was forced to act in a dishonorable way. That regret, that guilt continues to just build up within her, crying herself to sleep because she can't take back the choice that she may have felt forced to make. And not long after that, in fact, I would probably argue suspiciously short amount of time, Bathsheba learns that this honorable man that she was married to is killed in battle. There has to be at least some suspicion on her heart to know David orchestrated her husband's death. Probably the last thing that she heard was that Uriah was told to go and report to King David before going back to battle. For me, it kind of has to feel a little bit like Diane Keaton in The Godfather, right? Just that understanding of, I think he did this. I think David had my husband killed. But either way, Uriah's gone. This honorable man who did nothing wrong is now being taken away by Bathsheba because of a moment that she regrets. This one stupid moment that Bathsheba may have felt forced to make has now led to the death of an honorable man. And Bathsheba, pregnant with another man's child, is forced to mourn. In verse 26 it said, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband Uriah had died, she mourned for him. She carries that moment with her that she felt she didn't have a choice, and it's led to the loss of a good husband and a good man. How much more would her regret feel compounded in this time? But she really doesn't get long to process this. The first part of verse 27 tells us when the time of mourning ended, David brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. Now that phrase, that time of mourning there, we got to look at that and we got to ask the question, how long is that, right? Bathsheba's pregnant. By now she's at least 8 weeks along probably before she found out that she was pregnant. Uriah's come back. That doesn't just happen because he's got to walk all that way. Now Uriah's been sent back and he has died. So how long is that period of mourning? Because we're not too far away when people are going to start to notice. I did some digging on this because you know I had to. 7 days. A week. Bathsheba is given 1 week to mourn for her husband before she's swept away by the man who forced her into a choice that she didn't want to make, and now she's become pregnant by that choice, and now that same man has had her husband killed. And she has to marry him in the hopes that maybe we can cover all this thing up and wrap it up with a nice pretty bow. If it had been a man of high honor in the area, somebody who was really important, if it had been David himself, the time of mourning would have probably been closer to 30 days. That's what Moses got. The nation of Israel mourned for him for 30 days. But Uriah's just some dude. He's a soldier who died in battle. 7 days was customary. 7 days to process through all of this, to figure out how this moment of regret has changed and completely altered and completely shifted Bathsheba's life away from what she thought it was going to be. And now she has to marry the king in an effort to cover up the decision that he made in the first place. There's likely going to be talk in all of Jerusalem about what a great guy the king is. Because we've mentioned for 3 weeks now that women didn't have a whole lot of rights, and particularly widows would have to struggle on throughout the rest of their lives. And so here comes the king to take this young widow and marry her and save her from that life. What a great guy the king is. All the while, he's the one that orchestrated all of these events. And Bathsheba has to stand there and smile. If all this weren't enough, if all of this weren't enough to guarantee that Bathsheba would spend the rest of her life regretting this one particular moment that she probably felt forced to make, as if her regret couldn't weigh any more heavy on her. The baby that came from this choice forced upon her, the baby that was the source of David trying to manipulate things to make Uriah seem like he was the father, and when that didn't work, to ultimately kill Uriah, the baby that was the source of this compounding grief in Bathsheba's life, the baby dies. It says in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 15, the Lord struck the baby that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became deathly ill. A couple of verses later, on the first part of verse 18, it says, on the 7th day, the baby died. Try to imagine the pain that Bathsheba feels. in a very short window of time. All because she made the decision to take a bath. Everything has changed. And probably not a lot of it for the better. She lost a moment of her innocence because she felt like she didn't have a choice. Her husband was manipulated by the king. When that didn't work, her husband was killed by the king. She barely gets time for his body to get cold when she's forced to marry the king. And the one saving grace in all of this, the idea of new life, of a child that she gets to have for herself, a child dies. In many ways, this choice forced upon her likely feels like it's ruined her life. And so often that's how regret feels. Those moments that we have, that each and every one of us have in our own lives, those moments that we make a choice that we should not have made, or we say something that we really wish we hadn't, it can feel like those ruin our lives. When it's big enough, when it's hard enough, when it's painful enough, we begin to wonder, how is anything ever going to get me made better in the midst of this? How is life ever going to become anything more than just this regret that I feel? Regret is something that can taint every other part of our lives. It affects the way that we feel in even the most normal of circumstances. Because most of those times, those regrets come from choices that we made without considering ripple effects. About how this one choice is going to impact other choices. And once a choice is made, it cannot be unmade. Once an action is taken, we can't just go back a couple of chapters and make a different choice. It'd be so great if that's the way that life worked, but it's not. So we're kind of forced to live with that regret. Bathsheba had probably regretted the choice that David forced her in, but her regret didn't change that choice. And it had bucket loads of ripples that nobody could have foreseen. But the amazing thing about God is that God is somehow, and it boggles my mind how He's able to do this, God is able to take the thing that you regret most, and if you let Him, help it lead to something really good. God is somehow able to take those moments that we regret, and He's able to utilize them to help make positive changes in our lives or in the lives of other people, to use our story of our pain and our regret to help others avoid making those same choices. And sometimes, God's able to take a moment that we regret and help it lead to something really, really good. Because that's what He did for Bathsheba. Not far after that baby dies, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 24, we read, "Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba. He went to her and slept with her. And she gave birth to a son and named him Solomon." And you and I very recently talked about the kind of impact that son was going to have. Had that moment not have happened, had that choice that Bathsheba felt forced into not have taken place in her life, Solomon, who again had it not been for the way his life ended, we would have widely considered him to be the best king in all of Israel. Solomon would have never been born. He wouldn't have been there to be able to ask God for that wisdom. He wouldn't be able to lead and usher the nation of Israel into a time of peace and prosperity that they'd never experienced before, and likely haven't experienced since. God found a way to take this horrific choice forced upon Bathsheba and turn it into something good, not just for Bathsheba as being the mother of the king, but for the entire nation of Israel. And it doesn't stop there. Because like we said way back at the beginning, Solomon would continue to carry on the line and the lineage that would usher in the birth of Jesus himself. God was able to take this moment that Bathsheba likely regretted, this choice forced upon her, and he would weave that into the story of his ultimate redemption. And this shows us that Christmas is where God redeems our regrets. That choice that you made that you regret every single day since, that thing that you said that led to that family member not speaking to you anymore, that time when you felt like you didn't have any other choice in the matter, but you really wish you did. Christmas shows us that God is able to redeem that in ways that we couldn't even begin to process. Ways that we couldn't even begin to fathom. God can bring about a redemption that's not just good for you, but it's good for everybody around you. God can take that regret and turn it into something that you can say, you know what, I wish I hadn't made that choice, but look what God did with it. Sometimes you have to keep reading the story. You may get a few more pages and wish you could go back and make a different choice, but sometimes you got to keep reading because you don't know how great it's all going to turn out at the end. The story of Bathsheba shows us that Christmas is when God begins to redeem our regrets. I'm not trying to minimize anybody's pain in here. Please don't misunderstand that, or anybody who's watching online. I don't know what you've gone through. I don't know what that moment is that you regret. But I can tell you that if God is able to redeem that choice that Bathsheba was forced into and turn it into something great, it took a long time for it, don't get me wrong. She didn't know when Solomon was a baby that he was going to become the next king. She didn't know how that was going to lead to a prosperity in Israel. She didn't know that it was also going to lead to the Messiah. But God was still able to redeem that situation in ways that Bathsheba herself could probably never have fathomed. And I believe that God can do the same with your moment of regret. But you have to let him. You got to keep reading. You can't turn back anyway. So you might as well keep going. But I believe that God will help you see redemption from your regret. Because as Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, and we're going to close with it, God proves his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, we could read that as while we were still in our regret, Christ died for us. That choice that we made that we regret, we don't deserve God's love for that, but God's going to love us anyway. And if we let him, he'll turn it into something even better than we could have ever imagined.